Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Starting a Food Business webinar series. This is the first in three tonight, and then in another month we'll be meeting, and then again in March. Tonight is called Startup Basics, and we are thrilled to have so many of you with us tonight. We are part of OSU Extension, and for those of you that may not be familiar with Ohio State University Extension, we are an education-driven organization, and we really promote lifelong learning. So we're excited to be teaching you something tonight that we hope will benefit you and maybe your family, maybe something that you've always dreamed of doing. We're an outreach of the College of Agriculture, Food, Agriculture, and Environmental Sciences at The Ohio State University, and we're found all over the state of Ohio. So maybe for some of you, you're very familiar with OSU Extension in your own county. You may not know that there is a county OSU Extension office in all 88 counties across Ohio. So we just wanted you to know a little bit more about OSU Extension if you're not familiar with us, but we really appreciate you being here with us tonight. So there are 4 of us that will be part of this webinar tonight. My name is Emily Marison, and I'm an educator with OSU Extension in the area of family and consumer sciences. And tonight with me is Nicole Arnold. She is our field specialist for food safety here in Ohio. Garth Ruff is our field specialist for beef cattle, and Peggy Kirk Hall is our agricultural law field specialist. So we're all excited to share with you different aspects of starting up a food business. But before we get to that, we'd like to know a little bit more about you. So we have a few poll questions, and this is where you get to share some things that will help us know a little bit more about where you're coming from and what your experiences are. So our first question here is, what type of food are you either currently selling or are you interested in selling? We'll give you just about 10 more seconds to put in your final thoughts. All right, so as we look at who we have with us tonight, it looks like a lot of folks are either interested in or are already selling meat and poultry. So you will be definitely interested in hearing from Garth as we have our program in March. Though we'll be covering some of that tonight as well. A lot of baked goods, jams, jellies, and just kind of a variety of different things as well. I am kind of interested, a few of you put down other. Would you mind, I know we can't put things into the chat, but you can write into the Q&A. If you wouldn't mind typing those in, we're always kind of interested to see what kinds of things we didn't capture in our categories that we provide. Okay, so I see someone mentioned fresh produce. You know, that is one thing that we are not particularly going to cover, but we'll certainly answer any questions that will be around fresh produce. I see something written about freeze drying, different kinds of processing, and innovative processing is always something that we're interested in sharing with folks. Okay, very good. So lots of different, just some different kinds of things that folks are sharing. Maybe some very specialty kind of items that people are interested in. All right, so our next question for you, in addition to what type of food, I think it's coming.
It's all right. Emily, this one won't launch for some reason. Let me try again.
Okay.
Yeah, for some reason, it is not allowing me to launch. Having problems launching it. I apologize.
No, that's fine. Is the third one able to launch?
Yeah, let's try that one. Very odd. They're not, they're not allowing the launch.
Not cooperating. All right. Well, maybe we'll get that figured out in a little while and we can ask those as we go along. Oh, I see something. It just popped up.
Here we go.
So we're also wanting to know about what your interest in a food business is. Whether you're already doing something, whether you're on tonight because you're interested in starting something for the first time, if you're just kind of curious.
Are you still seeing that one, Emily?
Yes.
Okay.
Folks are still, I love watching the numbers all come in. Okay, I think we're probably pretty close with that one. And it looks like a lot of you are planning to start a food business or maybe not sure. So on to find out, which is a great reason to be on, to be learning. And some just want to learn more. And there are a few who already have a food business. So we're excited to see we've got a mix of lots of different folks that are on tonight. Our final question for you, we're just curious to know where you are watching from tonight. If you are living in a more rural area, if you're in a more urban area. And it looks like with just about everyone answering at this point, we have many of you that are on a farm and are interested in selling farm-raised products or things from your home as well. But thank you for sharing that information for us. It always helps us to know a little bit more of who we are talking to, especially when we can't see you on things like this. So as we look at what we'll be covering tonight, we're treating this like a food business checklist. So there are 4 common components when starting a food business, and the 4 of us will be covering these components with you tonight. The first that we'll start with is food safety practices. So managing risk in a food business really starts here. Food safety is of fundamental importance, and so Nicole Arnold will be covering that for us tonight. We'll touch on regulatory compliance, really just covering how important it is. In our next 2 webinars, we'll go into much more detail about what the actual regulatory requirements are for different food types. But tonight, we just want to enforce that food safety drives a lot of our food regulatory compliance, and we'll just touch on that a little bit tonight. Then we'll dive into economic viability. So even a great idea still has to make money. So Garth Rupp will cover that for us tonight. And then we'll wrap up the evening talking about legal risk management. And Peggy Hall will be covering how protecting yourself and your business is a very important part of having a food business. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Nicole Arnold, and she will be talking about our starting up a food business from a food safety perspective.
Had to unmute myself there. And I'm going to assume that you might have something else that you would rather be doing today. at 7 p.m. on a weekday other than talking about food safety. And if that's you, if you fall into that category, that is absolutely okay. I don't think that we have to pretend that food safety isn't oftentimes a very dry subject. But hopefully we're all here. I'm here at 7 p.m. instead of watching the rerun of The Bachelor premiere that preferred last night. You all are here, so I hope that we can work together to have a basic understanding of just how important food safety is to home-based businesses. And if any point in time, whether it's in relation to this food safety component, whether it's other aspects of this webinar or other webinars that will be taking place, if this information seems overwhelming, please know that that's okay. We are throwing a lot of different information at you all from a wide variety of topics. So if you walk away from my portion of this food safety presentation, just knowing a little bit more about food safety and knowing how you play a role in it, you get a thumbs up for me. Let's see if I can advance. Just so you know where we're going, I'm going to give a brief overview of foodborne illness in the US because I think that that's important to the conversation when we start talking about food safety risks. And we'll be diving into factors that affect the growth of microorganisms. And again, if I'm throwing terms at you like pH or water activity, and that doesn't mean anything to you at this time, that's okay. That's why all of us are meeting together tonight so that you know that we all are resources available to you if you have any of those questions. And also some applicable food safety considerations for a potential business or the business that you currently run. I wanted to start out by talking about my very fun start of 2013. So we're going to start out by talking about none other than diarrhea when it comes to foodborne illnesses. And so really this is a tale of how good, well-meaning individuals can still cause someone else to be sick. And I know we just started a new year. Everybody comes into the new year thinking, new year, new me, it's going to be great. And my 2023 started with a norovirus outbreak, which is very ironic with me being a food safety field specialist. So the story went that we were all getting together. It was a group of us for a dinner party celebrating the birthday of a toddler. And when I arrived to this dinner party, I noticed that the mother of the toddler was not there, and I immediately knew something was wrong. And someone told me that she did not come because she was sick. And now I took that as maybe she had some respiratory stuff, just a little icky illness. I didn't realize that she was vomiting. It's like my video turned off. I didn't realize that she was vomiting. Peggy, do you want me to turn off my camera?
No, I'm trying to bring the interpreter back on. Apparently the interpreter is not showing. So sorry for
Okay, got it.
interfering.
You're good. What had ended up happening was the mother who had been vomiting, and had I known that she had been sick and vomiting, I would have politely excused myself from that dinner party, knowing what I know. She had sent her husband and the toddler to this dinner party, thinking that she was doing a really good thing by staying home herself and sending them to celebrate. And it turns out that norovirus was running rampant, and they didn't realize that if someone in your household came into contact with someone who was vomiting, they could also spread it even if they did not have symptoms. So the dinner party was on a Saturday night, and I woke up Monday morning and I knew immediately that something was very, very wrong, and contacted the other individuals who were at this get together. And it turns out that many of us had some of the very fun symptoms of norovirus, like explosive diarrhea and projectile vomiting. If you're lucky, and get noro, you might just have both of those symptoms. But again, just a tale that it doesn't matter if you're well-meaning, it doesn't matter how much you know about food safety, you still are not immune to getting a foodborne illness sometimes. The CDC estimates annually that 48 million people get sick. And the vast majority of foodborne illnesses, I think that maybe this is something that folks may not realize, are not reported. And I try to ask people when we talk about foodborne illnesses, the majority of people have either gotten ill from food or thought they became ill from food. And I like to ask, how many of you reported your symptoms or your illness to your local health department? And even myself, I'm a bad food safety specialist. I did call the local health department and they didn't answer the phone. Should have left a voicemail, but I'll have to get on them for that. But foodborne illnesses, they can happen to anyone. We know that they occur, even though I would consider the US to have a very safe food supply, it doesn't mean that illnesses still don't happen. This is a representation of the different types of food that have contributed to foodborne illness over a period of time. And just in case this is helpful for anyone, when I use the term foodborne illness, that's just a really fancy way of saying someone who got food poisoning, someone who got a stomach bug is how that might be interpreted by other folks. And this is just to show that pretty much any type of food commodity can be linked to a foodborne illness. I think that there's consumer perception that certain foods are what make us ill, and certain foods do come with more risk than others, but we need food safety measures for all foods, even the ones that aren't as risky. So how do these foodborne illnesses occur? CDC has determined that there are a few different risk factors that continuously occur, so that those improper cooking temperatures, not cooking to the right temperature. And we still today use indicators like the juices run clear, or maybe you're cooking a hamburger and you say, oh, there's just a little pink inside. Really, those are not science-based ways of determining doneness. Just throwing this in there for those of you who are, I find it interesting, is that there are so many hamburgers that will turn brown before they ever reach a safe internal temperature. So really using a meat thermometer is the only way to determine that a food item, especially meat and poultry, has reached a safe internal temperature. Improper hot and holding based on temperature, we generally say keep hot foods hot and cold foods cold. Poor employee health and hygiene, and in this case, it may just be a food handler. So making sure that all individuals who are coming into contact, not just with the food, but with food surfaces as well, are clean, hygienic, have washed their hands, etc. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Dirty and or contaminated utensils and equipment. I'm sure that many of you will be using some type of equipment or utensils in your home. And then food from unsafe sources. I really wanted to hone in on this one because this gets left off of a lot of these lists, especially in home kitchen scenarios. Food from whether it be unsafe or safe sources means that the food that you are purchasing, or it could be ingredients that you're purchasing, those individuals are also adhering to food safety guidelines. And I see these lists all the time of cook, clean, chill, separate in your home as being primary steps to reduce the risk of foodborne illness. But I'll give you an example with this unsafe sources where those steps that I just mentioned don't mitigate the hazard. So I think a great example of this is romaine lettuce, which some of those outbreaks have been really popular in the past or have been publicized in the past several years. If you take romaine lettuce, it doesn't matter if you are putting it in the refrigerator, if you're keeping it separate from raw meat and poultry, and we're not going to cook our romaine lettuce. That's not going to happen. We have to take those types of foods into consideration as well, where contamination is happening prior to it ever reaching you. I wanted to highlight this botulism case. I'm sure many of you from the area are familiar with it. This is what I would consider to be an extreme case, but this happens. And this was in relation to canned potatoes, so home canned potatoes. But again, this is a situation where someone who was probably very well-meaning used home canned potatoes to make potato salad, brought it to a church potluck, and many people got ill, and I believe one individual died as well. And this was all due primarily for them because they processed it in a way that did not ensure the safety of the food product. I came up with some reasons why I think you all should care about food safety. Hopefully you do too, or maybe some of these resonate with you. Food safety practices, they might be required for whatever type of food product that you might be interested in making. Pathogens, and that may be an unfamiliar term. I really just mean those bad germs that can cause illness. They're naturally present in foods and different types of commodities and the environment. I think that's something that a lot of people don't know is it doesn't mean that you're an unclean person when we're saying that food safety is important in your home. Pathogens are everywhere. They're in the soil, they're in the environment, and that's why we have to put measures in place to keep them from getting in our food products. We know that people can get sick from food, and sometimes it's a lot more severe than just your general GI symptoms. Again, just because you're well-intentioned doesn't mean that you can't get someone sick from the food that you produce. If you're someone who consumes the product as well, could become sick. So think about yourself and your loved ones as well. And I hear this one time and time again, that I've been doing this for years and no one's gotten sick. And please know that, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're a magical person. You could have had a lot of good luck on your side, that these things do occur and it could still happen. And from a business perspective, your business could no longer be operating. And I think reputation is a really big one, especially if you're a small business. Just one publicized, whether it be a mistake, whether it's real or not, a link to food safety can take a small business out. So we want to make sure that we're maintaining a good reputation as well for the food products that we are making. So I did mention that any type of commodity has a risk of playing a role in a foodborne illness. But with that being said, some foods, based on a variety of factors that we're going to talk about, have a greater likelihood of making someone sick than others. Okay. And this really pertains to why certain foods have to follow different regulations. It is not this one size fits all approach. There are certain food safety measures and also requirements based on what type of food you are planning to make. And I think that that's a really important part of this conversation. Before I dive into those factors that affect the growth of microorganisms, I wanted to just make this point, and this is fresh on my mind because I see so much misinformation on social media and online, where spoilage microorganisms are different than pathogens. And what I mean by that, and I'll give you some examples as well, is that just because a food is showing signs of spoiling, of going bad, is how people put it a lot of the times, doesn't mean that it has pathogens all over it. And I think a great example of this, and this is where there was an infographic that was shared by WebMD. And of course, I know that they're not a science-based resource, but I was still very disappointed at how off they were with creating this infographic. They suggested that from a food safety perspective, that milk, and I'm talking pasteurized, refrigerated milk, should be thrown out every single time if it's past its expiration date or its best by date. Now, when it comes to a food safety standpoint, I would never throw away, again, pasteurized, refrigerated milk that you're purchasing from the store or reputable source if it didn't smell bad. And that's because spoilage microorganisms are what cause that milk to become kind of stinky, right? Like we call it the smell test. You give it a little whiff, and if it smells okay, then you continue to eat it. And in that specific case, with that specific product, that's okay to do. So again, spoilage microorganisms are different than pathogens, so ones that are going to cause those foodborne illnesses. This is a mnemonic device, Fat Tom. We use this in the food safety world all the time when we do education for factors that we need to consider for food safety. So food, acidity, temperature, time, oxygen, and moisture. And some of these characteristics are going to be a lot more easy to control than others. Again, this is very situation dependent. And some of these characteristics are going to be more important to you and your product than others. Again, depending on what you're attempting to make. I like to say that pathogens have preferences, just like all of us. I can give you an example. I'm from North Carolina. I'm having lots of fun with this very cold and snowy and icy Ohio weather. So I tend to thrive in warm environments, right? I'm happier. There's a lot more time in the day for us to get things done or to go for walks outside. I normally don't look as pasty either when it's the summertime. And pathogens, all the different types of pathogens, they have preferences too. There are certain environments that they may survive in, and there are certain environments that they may thrive in. Those are two different things. So whether a pathogen is going to continue to exist in an environment, or maybe we create an environment unintentionally where these pathogens, they're thriving, they're having a good time, and they're multiplying. And we want to make sure that we're not doing that. The F in Fat Tom stands for food. And the makeup of any type of food plays a role in whether it's going to support that microbial growth or not. So things like nutrients and whether it has protein. And I've just tried to give some very basic examples to get you to start thinking about some of these factors. And really, I would say we mitigate risk related to food on a very regular basis. You all do it, I all do it, even if you don't know that you're doing it. Even by using a refrigerator, you are reducing food safety risks for certain food products. So that apple, it's not sliced. It can sit out on a counter just fine. And that glass of milk, it's not in a sealed container. It's high in protein. Obviously, there's a lot of moisture. That's going to require refrigeration. Acidity, this is the degree of how acidic or how alkaline a food product is. And there's another slide giving you a little bit more of a visual. Most bacteria will not grow below a pH, that's how we measure the acidity, of 4.6. And that 4.6 tends to be a very important number, again, depending on what food product you're making, but just wanted to throw that out there. And just for reference, a pH of 7 is neutral. So that broccoli on the screen, that is a lot more alkaline than the lemon that you see. Okay? And that doesn't mean that broccoli's bad. It just means that it might be better at supporting microbial growth than that very acidic lemon. The pathogens are not going to like that acidic environment within a lemon. And I had a hard time finding a visual that had different examples. This is so unfortunate, but again, sort of that misinformation on social media and on the web, and also diet culture. The majority of charts that I was able to pull from the internet had to do with alkaline diets that have become so popular. I found that to be very disappointing. But on this slide, I did provide a link, and I can send this out as well, that this fact sheet is more in relation to canning, but it's about what pH is. And this is a fact sheet from Clemson. And really, there's not a lot of good resources out there that talk about pH, which again is how we would measure the acidity. And you can see how different types of foods, different food items have different pH values. And this is something that, let's say your food product, and I know I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself right here, but just wanted to put in this plug. A pH value might be beneficial to you, again, depending on what product you're going to make. And there are things like pH strips, as well as pH meters that can be purchased, which depending on what food product, one might be a lot more beneficial than the other. pH strips are normally not as reliable as an actual meter. So depending on how close you need that pH within a certain range, talking about how risky that food product is, you might want to make a choice based on that. And this is not a plug for a specific food or a specific pH company. This was pulled off the internet, but just wanted you to see a visual of what a handheld pH meter looks like. And I know that there are some nonprofits, there's some entities in Ohio that might allow constituents to come in and use their pH meters as well. And there's also some services where you can send in your food products for testing too. Temperature is one of the T's in that fat, Tom. We want to keep hot foods hot and cold foods cold. Bacteria really like what we call the temperature danger zone. So it's that area between that 40, that refrigeration temperature, up to 140. We want to try to keep foods out of that range to the best of our ability. And just giving an example, this actually happened today. I got a call from a family and consumer science educator asking a question from a constituent who had had a deep freeze go down. And see, this will be a great story for why we should have food safety measures in place. The deep freeze had a lot of meat stored away in it, and that deep freeze went down. And the individual did not have any way to determine how long that freezer had been down for or what temperature those products, no lock, no temperature indicator on there. And so unfortunately, if we don't know how long that food that needs to be refrigerated or frozen in this case was without proper temperatures, our recommendation is going to be to toss it. And that just breaks my heart because I know this person had put so much effort in creating this stock of frozen meat products. But from a food safety standpoint, if those frozen products were above that 40 degrees Fahrenheit for an extended period of time, then they wouldn't be safe to eat. Temperature is another T in the fat, Tom. This one always really trips people up, and I'll give another example as well, just to show you how these characteristics, we really have to be in tune with them, because just one little change, or it could be one different variation of a food product, can then change that food completely from a food safety standpoint. So homemade pumpkin pie, it requires temperature control. Because it has the ability to support the growth of microorganisms. And note that I said homemade pumpkin pie. Now, my example is that if you purchase commercially made pumpkin pie, which I'm someone who's not going to do that, I want my homemade pumpkin pie. let's say you go to the store and buy it there, those pies can be left on the counter. And the reasoning is because they have preservatives and they also control for some of the factors that we've talked about or will continue to talk about. Now, I'll probably confuse you more by saying this. If we make something like a homemade apple pie, again, homemade, but a different type of pie, an apple pie, that doesn't require refrigeration. And the reason why is because those apples are acidic. Again, it doesn't support microbial growth in the same way that an alkaline product would. And because we've added a lot of sugar to that food product, which also plays a role in food safety that we'll talk about. Very confusing, I know, but that's why it's very important to know these different factors, and they all intertwine with one another as well. Time, so when low acid or high protein foods are left out, again, for a long period of time, they can support the growth of microorganisms. So we want to make sure that if something comes out of the oven and there's leftover food that needs to be refrigerated, that there's not this extended period of time between the time being done and when it gets to refrigerated temperatures. And rice is a good example of that because people always like to make rice in bulk. And if we put it in a very, let's say, large container and put it in the refrigerator, it may have difficulty getting down to refrigerated temperatures with such a large amount of food. So that's something else to consider as well. Oxygen. Most foodborne pathogens that we're worried about, with the exception of a few, are aerobic, meaning that they want oxygen to grow. So you can see the packaging, it just serves as a barrier from the food to the outside environment. And I think another great example that we see in our everyday lives, if you're someone that eats yogurt, is that if you have an individual container of yogurt and it has that seal on the top, if it's not open, if it's not peeled back, you can keep that container for much longer than what the best by date states. I would say months, as long as there's not mold or as long as that seal hasn't been broken. But if you've ever pulled that seal back and you've eaten, let's say, half of the container, decided that you couldn't eat the rest of it, and you put it back in the refrigerator, you're more likely to see something like mold grow on there because of the exposure to the outside elements. And the last one is moisture. Moisture supports the growth of microorganisms. So this is granola. This is a pretty dry food product, pretty low risk. But if you take something like a kiwi, a whole uncut kiwi can sit on your counter just fine. But the moment that you slice that kiwi, now it requires refrigeration because you've changed that environment, you've opened it up, and now that moisture is now available. Now, this term water activity is a really tricky one, but I wanted to go here, at least mention it, because it does play a really big role in some of our home-based food products. And moisture and water activity, they relate to each other, but those terms are not interchangeable. And if this is all very confusing, just know this is a concept that food science students still have difficulty learning. So how I said with pH, that value of 4.6 was really important. For water activity, we have another value, just to confuse you a little bit more. There's all different types of numbers. And this 0.85 is the cutoff that we often use when it comes to food safety for water activity. So, and the reason why is because food with a water activity below 0.85, it doesn't allow for a spore to germinate or grow into a vegetative cell. And really what that means is that it makes sure that an environment isn't created where these spores, these almost dormant seeds, can come back to life and then become harmful. And also there's different pathogens that can't grow at certain water activity levels. And so that's great. Again, that's why we have certain food safety measures. If we can control the water activity, then it's likely that we can control some of the pathogens that we would normally see associated with certain food products. And when it comes to water activity, this is where there's a difference between moisture and that term water activity. It's not so much about whether a food is moist or if it's dry when it comes to water activity. I would say fruit jams is a great example of a food that is very moist but has a low water activity, which is what we want. And this is why those fruit spreads, or in this case, a strawberry jam, I should say, can sit on a shelf and not be refrigerated until it's open for quality reasons. And that's because, and keep in mind, I mentioned that sugar component with the apple pie example. When we add sugar to this product, it binds with the available water. So water activity is what is the water that's available to support microbial growth. So that's why ingredients like sugar or salt, which may not seem very important in the day-to-day, are actually very important to food safety. And kudos to Emily. She helped to develop this info sheet. This is just a snippet of it. And we'll be sending this out as well because I think it's a great resource. Really what I talked about was in relation to what we would call biological hazards, but there's also a lot of other types of hazards that we would consider with food safety. So that might be chemical hazards, physical hazards, and food allergens. So just some quick examples of those. Where you keep your sanitizers or cleaning agents is something that we need to take into consideration for your operation. Physical hazards, it could be something like hair, jewelry, sticks, stones. It could be something like a light bulb. So keeping in mind that if you're making a food product in your house, that those light bulbs cannot break and fall into product. And then food allergens as well. And just recently sesame, just throwing that out there, was added to our Big 8 list. Just a few more considerations before I pass it over. We've talked about those factors that affect the growth of microorganisms, but some other considerations as to how this might be applicable to your business is thinking about, again, the sourcing aspect. So where are you getting your food ingredients from? And are they following food safety protocols? We need to know what questions to ask suppliers. Hygiene and sanitation. So hand washing. Do you have a sink that, again, and I understand in certain situations, we may not have a perfect setup, but thinking about what is a better than step versus, oh, I don't have a hand washing sink, so I don't care. There might be sinks that are designated for food purposes only, and then a sink for hand washing. And really that's not all too far-fetched, because the majority of us, I would say, there's usually a hand washing sink in our home bathrooms. And someone brought it to my attention recently that it would be a good practice to wash your hands in that bathroom after using the bathroom, instead of doing something like going down to a kitchen sink and washing them there. And then handling and preparation. So thinking about how we're going to minimize cross-contamination, or another way of saying that could be making sure that raw product isn't coming into contact with your finished product. Processing and packaging should be considered as well, whether these are, maybe it's canned foods, whether it's meat products, and then with the packaging, is it going to be individually packaged? What types of packaging will support food safety as well as quality? And then the aspect of storage and transportation. Where are you going to sell your food items at? And even very basic things like, are you going to stick the food products in your car? And what does that distance look like? Maybe you might consider putting food items in something like a cooler or an insulated bag when you travel with them. Again, depending on what that food product is. I'm sure you all have heard that enough. So just last little bit of food safety considerations. This is more specific to a home business. Where are your ingredients stored? And making sure that there is some separation, if need be, between what you and your family members consume and where you would store products that would be used for products intended to be sold. Where is the product prepared? I don't know about you all, but I live in a very small duplex, and my kitchen is very teeny tiny, and that's something to consider. Where I put different food items, again, raw product and finished product that's ready to go, that can be a little bit tricky for folks depending on how your kitchen is designed. There are things to consider like the order of how you prepare your products, again, where it's stored. We talked about those designated sinks. How to manage pests. So do you have pests we all have pests in our home in some capacity, but are we keeping the windows open? Also pets. I don't know about you all, but I have a dog, and you may not be allowed to have animals in your house or within your operation. But in some cases you may be able to. But if I even merely sit on the couch, I'm going to walk away with a bunch of dog hair all over me. So the first thing that I do is I'll change clothes, put on an apron when I'm preparing food for other people. And also we have to consider other individuals who are in our household. Do they know what the boundaries are in terms of working with that food or touching other ingredients? How do we manage them? And then some basics with hygiene. I always think it's a good practice if you have longer hair to go ahead and pull that up. Nobody wants a hair in their food. And also putting a cap on, a clean cap that's only used for food preparation purposes. Maybe even consider a beard guard if necessary. Making sure that you're not wearing jewelry. It's also good practice to not have long nails or nail polish too. You don't want those to flake off into your food products. That's all for now for the food safety portion. But again, if you have any questions at all, feel free to reach out. That's what we are here to do.
Thank you, Nicole. So for our next section, we will jump into regulatory compliance, another item on our starting up a food business checklist. This quote is from Upton Sinclair, and about 100 years ago, Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle. And this was trying to draw attention to the poor working conditions of employees, but instead it completely grossed out everyone who read the book, who learned about the poor handling of the meat that they were consuming. So just 1 year after he published this book, the original Food and Drug Act was passed. And the aim was to protect consumers from misbranded and adulterated food. When it comes to regulatory compliance for selling food in America today, it looks a little different than then, but the aim to protect the consumer remains the same. Regulations are created based on the food safety principles that Nicole was just sharing with us. It's scientific knowledge about food safety that drives the regulations that we need to follow. And there really is a reason behind the rules and the laws that we're asked to follow. So as you look at these entities that are on this slide, their responsibilities are largely associated with the food type that falls underneath them. So FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, really is responsible for regulating most food, seafood, dairy, and shell eggs. The USDA will regulate meat, poultry, and egg products. And then here in the state of Ohio, our Ohio Department of Agriculture is responsible for cottage food and may also inspect facilities. There's a large list of different licenses or registrations that fall under ODA. So I'm only showing you this at this point just to make you aware that there are a lot of different options that are available here in Ohio. We're going to go into much more detail about this next month when we talk about operating a home-based business. And then again in March, when Garth will be covering in detail about selling meat and poultry. So have no fear. We're going to get to those things, to the rules and the regulations. But our goal tonight is really just to begin to have that conversation about the reason why the rules are so important. The reason that they're in place, the intent is to protect the consumer. We as the producers, when we're being compliant, this reduces our risk of harming our customer. And that's what we want as food business entrepreneurs, to provide our customer with a safe and quality, outstanding product, both safe and quality. And if we're being honest, it needs to be a product that makes money. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Garth Ruff, and he's going to dive into the reasons that it's important to have a plan from an economic standpoint as we're starting up our food business.
Thanks, Emily. Certainly providing a high quality products part of this and doing it safely. But at the end of the day, if we're going to go into a business venture, it needs to be profitable. And probably the biggest challenge that I see in starting a home or farm-based business is we got to really dial in and understanding what our costs are. Creating budgets, using tools that work for that specific operation to understand what that cost of production is, because we can't price products unless we know what it costs to produce them. So whether we're producing an acre of soybeans, a pound of meat, a loaf of bread, a lot of this is the same process, right? We need to know what our overhead costs are. Those can be the most challenging. We need to know what our variable costs are and really dial down on that per unit cost of production, right? On the animal side of things, I work with a lot of producers who can tell me what it costs maybe to get that steer to a finished weight. But they really struggle with pricing that product or figuring out that cost per pound. We'll spend a lot more time on that in March as we, really start to break down that animal and get it to a pound of meat to calculate those costs. Marketing, right? A lot of times, maybe those are forgotten costs. What does it cost to acquire a customer? And I assure you, there is a cost there, right? It could be as simple as time, but there's definitely a cost in marketing, pricing products. Big thing here is how much money can you make and do you want to make? Those are two questions we need to ask. And a lot of that goes down to understanding our customer, our potential consumer. We have a lot of resources here at Ohio State available to help on that marketing side of things. And I'll finish up with those here today. But we think about overhead costs, right? Sometimes they're difficult to measure, especially if we're producing that product in our home or on the farm. All right. A lot of times our utilities, what percentage of those do we assign to the business? Equipment, right? Do we already have what's needed to be successful? Is there a cost to use that equipment? And then what happens if we need to replace it? Right. Even a mixer, if we compare equipment in this sense to a farm operation, equate that mixer to a tractor, there's a cost there. Right, both to use that equipment, and then if I do have to replace it, certainly that's substantial. Insurance risk, Peggy's going to talk more about that, but there may or may not be a cost there. Labor and management, right? What is our time worth? What is your time worth? I think that's a question you need to ask and figure in into a budget as we start thinking about total cost of production, right? And then more often than not, your business probably doesn't pay rent, but in reality, if you have a farm or home payment, right, this business might be contributing to that. And on the animal side, I like to talk about this concept of yardage, and we'll talk about that a little bit more and everything that gets lumped into into that as an overhead cost. So we think about marketing cost, right? And really, as we start up our business, hopefully we have customers or potential customers identified before we have that product available to sell, right? Are we going to go to the farmer's market? Are we going to market things online? Certainly social media is available. Are we going to look at paid advertising and ads on the internet? Right? There's time, there's labor. If we're going to go to that farmer's market, certainly there's fuel, some licenses, potentially those type of things. We need to work all that into that marketing cost and add marketing into our overall cost of production. Right? From a marketing standpoint, the more efficient we can be early on and really figure out who our customer is and build that customer profile, that's going to help us in the long run. All right. And this all comes down to building a brand. And in March, we'll use a few more examples about what some of those brands are on the meat side, but certainly they're recognizable. Just one kind of slide on building a brand, and kind of pulled some of this from a project from my days as a student, right? As we build a brand, all right, we need to have an identity. What is our mission? What's the values and vision of our company? What is the defining characteristics that separates me from the competition, right? Separates you from the competition. Brand promise, right? We need to be able to deliver on that promise. Certainly local is probably part of that, but we need to focus on quality, right? We don't have a quality product. Marketing, the best budget, all right, we can throw that out the window if we can't deliver on quality. All right, personality, can we connect with that potential consumer? And what are our brand signals, right? I put these 3 different logos on the screen and some work from NCBA, National Cattlemen's Beef Association. They were testing, how recognizable is beef what's for dinner? Well, about 40% of consumers, right, recognize beef what's for dinner on a regular basis. Compare that to 64% of consumers for McDonald's, and less than 20%, I believe around 19, for the new pork brand, Pork Be Inspired. I know there's probably several people on this call that know a different slogan, a different logo for pork products, right? One time it was the other white meat versus Be Inspired. So we have kind of those big picture overhead costs that may or may not be super easy to grasp or super tangible. We have marketing cost, a cost to acquire a potential customer, and then we have variable cost, right? What do we need to purchase to make this business function? What do we need to purchase to make this business or to make our product that we have available to sell? Certainly that are things like ingredients, right? Consumable supplies that it takes to produce. Think about packaging, freezer paper, plastic, those type of things, feed, seed, from the animal side of things, feed's a huge variable cost. Then the other thing, that's kind of easy to lose track of in my mind is this yield loss, right? When I start with a set of ingredients, I don't like washing dishes, in a large part because of this, right? But if I start with a set of ingredients and go to make a recipe, inevitably I have a mixing bowl that still has some of those ingredients left in it that needs scraped out, needs washed out, right? So one batch of, say, a loaf of bread doesn't sound like much, but if I'm making 20, 30 loaves of bread and I can't control my waste or yield loss, or I'm harvesting an animal and trimming too much fat off at the packing plant, we got to consider that waste. when we go to price a product. Right, keeping track of costs fairly easy. I would certainly encourage you, for no matter what your enterprise is, to kind of put together a budget. Doesn't have to be anything fancy, just something that you can put tangibly on paper and get an idea of what it may cost for your food production enterprise. Pricing a product. Oh man, this is one that question I get fairly often. Somebody will call or send me an email. I want to produce freezer beef, freezer pork, meat of some sort. What should I charge for it? I'm not going to answer that question. I'm just flat out not going to answer it. But what I will do is we can work through 2 or 3 ways to help you calculate, right? To help you come up with a way to price your product. But first and foremost, to get there, we need to know cost of production, right? The cost of that animal, the value of that animal if we produced it ourselves, feed cost, right? And this is a meat example. It's what I'm more familiar with, right? Feed cost, or the value of that feed if we raise it ourselves, right? If I can sell corn today for $6.80, $6.90, right? That's probably the true value of that feed, right? Yardage, that's our overhead cost plus time plus labor. What do we put that labor rate at a per hour basis? Probably highly variable from one food enterprise to the next. What is the slaughter cost? The cost to cut, package, label that product. What am I paying that processor? Transportation, once again, fuel, licensing fees, advertising. And that just gets me to break even, right? That's the price I have to have not to lose money. Then we can divide that by the yield of that product and come up with an average price per pound that's break even that we need over the entirety of that carcass in this example, right? And it's no different if we're making bread, making cookies, baked goods, right? It's still similar things that we're going to plug in. It's just going to be different in the overall as to what we plug in. So how do we calculate that profit margin? And we'll spend a little bit more time on the meat side of this in March as well. Once again, that's up for you to decide. More than willing to help you get there, right? So what percent margin are you comfortable with? I'd encourage you to do some research on your competitors, because price in the marketplace has a lot to do with purchasing decisions of food products. Right? If I'm $2, $3 a pound higher than the competition at the local food farmers market, that could be an issue. But we've got to be profitable, right, in order to sustain this business, right? So we'll talk a little bit more on the meat side of things. What will the market bear? What does your customer profile say, right? Where are you trying to market your product to that customer? That should tell you a lot about your customer profile, right? Am I in rural Southeast Ohio, or am I in Columbus in the 270 outer belt? Am I in a college town, right? Am I in an area with a large amount of disposable income? We need to really start focusing on marketing and building that customer profile and doing some of that research. That'll give us an idea of what they're willing to pay, right? Willingness to pay is key. Size and scale certainly do matter. I think there's no expectation, and you're not going to be in business long if we're charging prices similar to the retailer, right? And we've all know what's happened with eggs here in the last, 6 months, a time or so, the price of eggs. I find it very interesting that I can still find folks here in Southeast Ohio that are willing to sell eggs for $2 or $3 a dozen, right? If somebody with 1 million birds has a hard time being profitable at $4 or $5 eggs, of course, there's a markup on that. Retailers got to make profit too. How can the neighbor down the road sell $2 eggs? I mean, that's something that's just baffled me really here in the last month or so, as that's become more of a discussion point. Marketing help, certainly here at OSU Extension, we got several resources available. There are a couple programs that can be taught, market ready. What does it need? What do you need to know to be ready to take your product to a market? Device ready, that's spending time on social media, how to market electronically, those type of things. A tremendous resource that we have in this arena is our OSU South Centers down in Piketon. I've linked a URL there to their direct marketing page. Christy and her team down there do a tremendous job working on how to market those products. And then there's also a center for cooperatives that work out of South Centers. If you're looking at that model, that might be an option for you as well. All right, so we've talked about food safety, kind of who does the regulatory side of things. Just briefly touched on how to make some money in the food business. And then Peggy's going to back clean up and really give us a primer of, what do we need to do from a legal side to manage risk as a food producer.
Well, thank you very much, Garth. That was informative and definitely helpful to the next topic on legal risk management, because of course the financial considerations are one of those risks that we have with starting a food business. So I want to give you an overview of what those other risks might be. And it becomes a little bit hard to organize risks in a nice, clear, simple way. Sometimes they run amok and one thing runs into another category. But as I tried to categorize the risk of starting a food business and what those legal risks could be, here's one way to look at it. First, we have that product liability risk, and Nicole highlighted how important food safety is. And that's certainly where that comes in when we're talking about product liability risk. We can be liable for producing what we refer to in the legal world as a defective food product. And that's one that either causes illness or death. So that's certainly a legal risk that we have as we start up a food business. We also have, as you all know, compliance liability risk. There are many applicable food safety and licensing and labeling regulations that we need to be aware of and comply with. And we can certainly do that to address some of those liability concerns. And then finally, I'd create another category that I'm calling general business liability risk. And these are some of the risks that we would see in any type of business. Many of us are engaged in farming. We see that type of general business liability there, as well as many of our other businesses that we engage in. It's not specifically unique to food businesses, but within this category, I would place some of those risks, as Garth just covered, for your business decisions, your financial decisions. We have contracts and employees and taxes and our property. All of those kinds of components of our business can create what I'm calling here general business liability risk. So a lot to worry about, but what we try to do is manage the risk, manage all of these different risks that we can do, and starting to focus on that right from the beginning as you're starting your food business is a good time to try to manage some of those risks. You've done that already by attending here tonight. One way to reduce your food product liability risk is to know and understand food safety practices, to train your employees to do the same, to have food product insurance, and even the choice of business entity that you make can reduce and manage your risk there. Over in that general business liability risk area, we have some strategies there that can help reduce the risk. Understanding the kind of economic information and being careful with your financial and business decision making can certainly reduce that risk. But complying with some of the requirements for starting a business, the legal requirements, as well, again, as your business entity choice and insurance. Those are all tools that we can utilize to reduce those risks. And then when it comes to compliance liability, we need to know and understand those regulations and comply with those, whether it's licensing, labeling, inspection, complying with regulations. Understanding them, working with your regulators can certainly reduce that. And if something isn't in accord with those regulations or you have an issue, that's where food product insurance can come in and fill that need. So you can see that sometimes these things move around from one category to another, that some of the strategies work for several different kinds of risks. And so that's why it's helpful to know and understand and implement some of these strategies and try to reduce and manage your risk. You can't always do away with it completely, but you can try to reduce it as best you can. So I have a few thoughts on how to address some of those issues in the startup phase when you're getting started. I want to talk about 3 areas here that can address many of those risk factors that we just discussed. First is your business entity formation. Whether you should formalize. A question I hear all the time is, should I be an LLC? Should I be an LLC? Many, many people are aware of the LLC and wonder if that's something they should do as they begin their business. The second area that I want to talk about is just those steps to starting a business. Again, another question I receive a lot is, I want to start a business. What do I do? What do I have to do legally? What does the law require me to do to call myself a business? And so we'll talk about those legal startup steps. And then finally, we'll also touch a bit on insurance. You saw that as a very, very important strategy for reducing different types of risks. So I want to talk about coverage, the types of coverage you might need and where you find it. But note that this is an introduction. I don't have a whole lot of time left here to review all of these with you, but it's a start. You're going to need to take some of these topics into a little bit more depth, and you can do that, of course, with your professional advisors. So one question I want to ask through our polling tool that we have available to us here is, what type of business entity are you? Your food business. Do you have a business entity? What do you think your business entity is for your food business? So let's see, we're going to pop that poll up for you, and you can hopefully answer that question. Let me just get that going. There we go. Is that showing now for everyone? So what type of business entity is your food business? Are you a sole proprietorship, an LLC, a corporation or a partnership or a co-op, cooperative, or are you not sure what you are? That is not an uncommon answer, so don't worry about choosing that one if you're not sure. And we'll get a good sense here of what most of you are, if you are organized as a food business in some way or already operating as a food business. It looks like we have a pretty good split going on here so far, and looks like it's slowed down. So I'm going to end that poll, and you can see that we do have many LLCs. And as I said, that's very common. People are in tune with that option as a business entity. So that seems to be the majority, but many of you aren't sure. And then we have some sole proprietorships and a few who are in that more formal corporation category or a partnership or cooperative. So good to know how I can tackle the remaining topics here based on what you all are doing or already may be doing with your business entity. So let's talk very quickly about that question. Should your food business be an LLC? And I noted that many of you are on farms, and so you might already have an LLC for your farm. So you can ask this question in a different way. Should I also have an LLC for my food business that's separate from my farm or from any other type of LLC that I might already have? LLCs have become the chosen entity these days. That is the most common formation that we're seeing in many of our farm businesses. And that's because it does provide some liability protection. Usually a corporation or a partnership doesn't fit as well these days with many of the needs that we have with our farm businesses. And a lot of that's due to the ease of operation and the liability exposure that we might have with some of those other types of formal business entities. But note that you don't have to be a formal business entity. you can operate as what we call an informal business entity as a sole proprietorship. And that's very common as well, especially when you're starting out a business and don't have a lot in that business, not many business assets, not a strong product line yet. You might choose to be a sole proprietorship. And in that case, you and your business are one and the same. And the risk that you have there is that because you are the business, you are also personally liable and personally responsible for any liabilities of that sole proprietorship, that business that you are operating in your name. So you have more liability risk as a sole proprietor. Now, I'm breezing through these pretty quickly, but this is something that if you're unsure of, you should talk with your professional advisors, your attorney, your accountant, get some input on what should I be? Should I form as an LLC? Do I need another LLC? Those are all important questions to ask your professional advisors. But just to clarify what an LLC does, I think the name limited liability company can be a bit misleading, and it makes us think that we won't have any liability at all. It doesn't completely limit your liability. What it does is separates your business assets from your personal assets. And it's going to subject those LLC assets, or this would be the same in a corporation, those assets that are in the business are going to be subject to the liabilities of those business responsibilities. So as you see in the visual that I put up here on the right-hand side of the screen, if you have your business and you have the owner, and the owner has personal assets, we have the possibility that if there is a liability incident, we can go from the business to the owner and get to the owner's personal assets if we need to. If insurance doesn't cover or won't cover that incident, or it's not sufficient coverage, we may need to go after the owner's personal assets to satisfy that liability situation. If it's a sole proprietorship, that is what could happen. When we get into an LLC, however, we create a barrier. We put a wall there between that business and the owner and their personal assets. And instead, we force that liability back into the assets that are in that food business. But note, that's not absolute. There can be still, even with an LLC, ways to go after an owner, especially if the owner is at fault, did something to cause that liability incident. And most certainly, if it was an intentional act, we can get through that wall and get to those personal assets. But if you have significant non-LLC assets or non-food business assets that you want to protect, then an LLC can certainly create a barrier and help protect them from the liability of that business. And so those of you who are farming and also want to begin a meat business, you may want to separate those assets because those other farm assets can be significant, and we may need to protect those from the liabilities of the food business. But I want to highlight that good liability insurance is the first thing we need to look to. That is the best protection for addressing a liability situation. But if you do want to be an LLC, and I know many of you are, so I'm going to work through this very quickly, just to show you what is required to form an LLC. Now, you can have an attorney do this for you, and that can be very helpful, but we do have the option of trying to do this ourselves. I would, of course, recommend working with an attorney, working with your accountant, but a few steps to take to form an LLC. First, you have to decide on a name, and this is something that I find that people go, oh, okay. I need a name. Yes, you need a name to form your LLC, and your name needs to be distinguishable from other businesses that are registered with the Secretary of State in Ohio. So you have to have a unique name, one that isn't going to cause confusion as to who you are, who your business is, where people can find you. So choosing your name and a distinguishable name is the very first important step to choosing your LLC. There is a guide on the Ohio Secretary of State site that will help work you through that name process, and it will help you search, as I did here on the left side of the screen. I put in a search for Home Bakery LLC. If that's the name I want to be, I can put that in there and it will show me how many businesses have all or part of that Home Bakery LLC terminology in their name. And if someone else has it and my name would not be distinguishable, then I can't choose that name. I need to find another name. So I've given you here the links for searching for a business name, as well as the guide to naming your business that's available on the Ohio Secretary of State's website. Note too, when you are filing for an LLC, you have to use LLC or limited liability company in the name of your business to notify others that you are an LLC. So if you don't want that name in your business, or you want maybe to use your kind of a doing business as name that's a little bit different from that, you can also file a trade name or a fictitious name. A trade name would be protected, whereas a fictitious name would not. But that's another option for going through that process of deciding what you're going to call your business. The doing business as is not actually a legal category that we have here in Ohio. Those two, the trade name and fictitious name, fill that category. So after you decide what you're going to name your business and you know that name is available, you would file articles of incorporation with the Ohio Secretary of State. It's a pretty simple form. It's available online and you can file it online, and it asks for some very basic information about where your business is located, its name, and you can put in some optional info, like what is the purpose of your business. That's not required. What is required, though, is that you appoint a statutory agent, and that will be the person who is responsible for receiving any legal notices regarding your business. So if there's a lawsuit, or if there are taxes due, overdue, those kinds of legal notices come to the statutory agent, and you must appoint a statutory agent, and that person must accept that position. There's a $99 filing fee. And when they accept your application, they will make sure that your name is available, and they will let you know if you can't name that business as you wish. And there is a requirement, an ongoing requirement, then once you're formed, to keep your statutory agent information up to date. So this is what you will receive once you form your LLC: a certificate from the Secretary of State showing that you are now, certified and registered as an LLC in the state of Ohio. But note, that's not enough. Just forming and thinking you're good is not enough. You also must function as an LLC. You can't be a sham organization that just filed to try to get that liability protection. You need to function. You could lose your liability protection if you don't really operate as an independent business. So that's where an attorney is really useful in helping you develop an operating agreement, rules on how you're going to operate that business, and also to help you set up separate accounts and records and those kinds of filings that you'll need to do, all separate from you as the owner of that LLC. So if you're not willing to do all of that, then you may not want to become an LLC, because taking that step may not provide you the liability protection that you think it will if you're not actually functioning as that LLC. So let's move on then beyond that formal business entity formation question and get into what else is involved in starting your business. Well, the Ohio Secretary of State, I've mentioned a couple of times already. That website is tremendous. A lot of good material on there, a lot of good resources on how to start your business, checklists, what you need to do. So I encourage you to look at that information, and also to work with an attorney or an accountant to make sure that you have taken all the steps that you need to take. There are quite a few, actually, steps that you need to do. So the first thing is registering with the Ohio Secretary of State. But note, if you have formed an LLC or a corporation or a formal entity like that you've already filed with the Secretary of State, that serves as your registration. But if you want to operate a business with the business name but not be one of those formal those formal entities, then you're going to need to register that business with the Secretary of State. So another step for those of you who may not choose to go that formal entity route, you can use that trade name registration to register the business name. Now, if you're just going to be a sole proprietorship and not have a business name, so you're just operating under your personal name, then you don't need to take this step either. All of these forms are available, the trade name registration, the fictitious name registration, on the Secretary of State's website. And we'll send all of those resources out for you if you want to check into those. So you'll also need to obtain a federal employer identification number. And this often confuses people, especially if you won't have any employees. I'll get that question, but I don't plan to have employees. Am I really an employer? Well, you're considered to employ yourself. And so you should file the EIN, and that is your identification number for tax purposes. So you need that number from the federal government, but beware, if you just go online and search federal EIN, all kinds of websites are going to come up that are going to try to charge you for helping you file for an EIN. Just avoid all of those, ignore those, don't use them, because it's free and it's online if you go to the official IRS website. So you need to go to irs.gov, make sure you are indeed on the IRS website. There are a lot of them out there that will try to trick you, and it's free to file for your EIN. And of course, you'll need your name for that as well. So all of these steps kind of flow together. The next step is to open a bank account in the business name. Remember, I said you need to separate those assets and function as a real business. This is especially important if you're organized as a formal business, but it can also make many of these other risk factors reduced if you can really separate that business financially, see those records, know those numbers, pay those bills all out of that actual bank account that is attached to that business. And most lenders will want you to have an EIN number in order to open a bank account. Now, a few will, if you're operating as a sole proprietorship, a few banks will say, well, we'll take your social security number as your tax identification number. But many of us don't want to give up our social security numbers anyway. So an EIN can protect you from that. Go ahead and file and get that number. This is a good time to make all of those business records separate and in the business name as you set up your banking accounts. You might also need to get a vendor's license from the Ohio Department of Taxation. Now, if we're just selling food that won't be consumed on site, a vendor's license is not necessary, because a vendor's license is used for the purpose of collecting and paying sales tax to the state. So any products that you sell, that would require sales taxes, you collect, and then you pay those through your vendor's license registration that you have with the Department of Taxation. But if you're not selling any items that would require collecting tax, then you don't need to worry about that. So any food items that are not consumed on site, on the site of your business, those do not require taxes, but there are many other non-food items or food consumed on site where you will have to collect the sales tax and then pay that over regularly to the state. So that's a $25 registration fee and a real simple process now for filing and paying those online. And then there is a lot that I could talk about. I certainly don't have time for this, but you also need to identify your employer responsibilities. Remember, you are your own employer as well, but there are requirements if you will have employees other than yourself that you may need to follow, like reporting your new hires, withholding taxes for them, Social Security, self-employment tax for yourself, workers' compensation requirements, all of those kinds of employee-related issues you need to follow up on. And here I would recommend, again, talk to your attorney, talk to some of those payroll or accounting type services. They know what needs to happen here. Get some good professional advice. Because we can't go through all the details necessary here, but be aware that these are requirements. And a trap we sometimes fall into in agriculture is we're exempt from some of these employee type laws. That won't be the case in many of our food businesses. So don't assume that because you are a farm or on a farm that your food business will have those same exemptions that we see with typical ag labor. And then we also need to look at some of the other licensing and permitting requirements beyond all of those that I've just explained. You're going to have the possibility of food licenses and regulations that will apply, registrations, inspections. We're going to talk about those in the next 2 webinars. But also you may have to check into your local zoning and building permit requirements that might be in place. So if you are engaging in a farm activity on a farm in a rural area, it's very likely that you're not going to encounter a zoning issue at all, because we do have pretty significant exemptions from many of those local zoning authorities that exist. If you're building a farm building, engaging in an agricultural land use. But if it's not an agricultural land use or an agricultural building, we could be subject to zoning. And certainly if you're within a municipality, and we saw many of you who are in cities or townships, or excuse me, cities or villages, you may have to check into your zoning regulations. If you're doing a home-based business or a home occupation, look at what your requirements are in that area for operating a home business. Some of them don't allow retail sales. Some of them don't allow you to have additional people parking. There are some, very unique, different types of provisions that might come through the zoning code that you need to look into. And you can see an example here on the right of those types of regulations that you might encounter. Okay, and very quickly, I know we're at time, so I'm going to go through this very quickly, but certainly an important startup question is insurance. What type of coverage do you need? And where can you obtain that? So insurance is, as I said before, a great tool for managing risk. It's your fallback if something does go wrong. And so you need to make sure you have that safety net if you are doing something that's particularly risky. And so we often have insurance on our homes, on our farms, on our vehicles. But note that a homeowner's policy is not likely to cover a home-based business or a home occupation or a farm-based business. So you need to know if you're just functioning right now with a homeowner's policy, what's in there, what will it cover if I do this type of food business. Also, a general farm liability policy might not cover some type of direct marketing of your food products, of those kind of consumable to the consumer type food products. That might be explicitly accepted from your policy. So you can have exclusions that would take that coverage out of a policy that you might already have. So you need to look into your policy, go over that with your provider, and you will most likely need some type of additional coverage if you are worried about your risk. So an amendment or a rider or an addendum to that policy. And sometimes your current provider might not offer that. Now, we are seeing a lot of activity in this area. So many of other providers do have food-based business type coverage available. But there's always that question, should I shop for a new policy? Can I get a better deal? I really think the best way to answer those questions is to talk to other food businesses and see what they're doing, or your business association that you might be engaged with. See what others are doing, who they're using, what kind of coverage they're having, and also talk with your professional advisors, your attorney and your accountant, your current insurance provider. There are many new options out there, and a little bit of research can go a long way at finding the best policy, the best coverage for your situation. So there are a few considerations as we think specifically about food businesses that we do need to address in an insurance policy. So is that home-based business going to be covered? Is there food product liability coverage? What about our equipment? If we have a lot invested in equipment, we want some coverage for that. Customers coming onto the property, that can create a huge liability risk if someone is harmed. And even advertising claims can put you at risk, as well as transporting your goods. And many of our farm markets, if you want to go and sell at those farmers markets, they will require that you have a liability insurance provision for anything that would occur there at the market. So a lot to think about there, but just a quick overview in helping you try to understand how to address and manage these food legal risks that we're talking about in regards to a food business. So I apologize for talking so quickly. I think we ran out of time a little bit sooner than we expected, but this is a beginning. So this is an introduction. Legal risk management requires vigilance, and it's an ongoing process. And you have to think of it from the business perspective. It's not, as Wolfgang Puck says here, it's not enough to just create a good food product. You have to be a good business person as well. And with that, I will turn things back over to Emily.
Thank you, Peggy and Nicole and Garth, and thank you all for being with us tonight. Just a little bit of follow-up information because you have gotten a lot of information tonight. Watch for an email soon from us, and it should come from Peggy Hall. If you're looking in your email, you'll be able to see her name on that. It'll have resources related to today's webinar, links to some important websites and other resources for you, and especially these slides as well as the recording from tonight. And you'll be able to find that at the Farm Office website under the Food Law Library. So you can go to go.osu.edu/starting a food business, and that will be available soon after we're done with this. But again, watch for an email, and all of those links and that information will be there for you. As you head out today, you will be whisked away to a screen that will have an evaluation. We plead with you to please fill that out for us, because it's only going to help us in the next 2 webinars to be able to plan well for you so that we can help give you the resources that you're looking for. It just helps us as we are trying to put the best educational materials together for those that are interested in starting a food business. So if you take 3 or 4 minutes to fill out that evaluation, we would really appreciate it. And we invite you to visit back with us in 1 more month. So our next program will be Tuesday, February 28th at 7 p.m. And we'll be talking about selling home-based foods particularly. When we get to March, we'll focus on selling meat at that time. But our next program will look at food product development, Ohio's cottage food law and home bakery laws, and requirements for selling canned foods as well. So if you're interested in any of those types of products, we hope to see you in February. And with that concludes tonight's program. Again, look for an email from us. And if you have questions in the meantime, we're happy to answer those questions for you. Have a great evening.